Hello, I'm Dr. Ron Eaglin coming to you from Daytona State College with CEN3722, Human-Computer Interaction. And today we're going to finish off our lecture on understanding users. So this is Understanding Users Part 2. If you had looked at, if you've seen the first lecture on this, really what this is all about is making sure that you understand the capabilities of your user and understand why it's important to understand the user. So what we're going to do is we're going to continue on with a few things that we didn't get from the first lecture. And the first thing is just how we're going to take that user into account when we go into product design. So one of the biggest steps that you're going to undertake when you're going ahead and looking at a product design or looking at an interface design is, in getting that understanding of the users, is just simply to sit down with your team and brainstorm who your users are. And when we do that, we have lots of different methodologies that actually help us organize this information. So we can create groups of users, and then what we can do is we can take those groups of users and look at how they actually correspond with the different tasks that you have to perform with your user interface design, and create a matrix of this. With that matrix of your tasks versus your users, you can now look at a lot of different ways of how the individual users that you've got to deal with. Remember, when you're doing this, you're not going to have one homogeneous set of users. They're going to be all over the place. But by looking at that matrix of the different groups of users with the different tasks that need to be performed, you can get a better idea of how you're going to actually approach the design. Now, in that brainstorming sector, I want to give you some ideas of how to look at different examples of going about the product design. So let's look at something as simple as an oven timer. And to tell you the truth, the beautiful dial timer, where you simply twisted the dial to the time you wanted and let it go, was one of my favorite designs because it was just quick and easy. But it also was imprecise. And different classes of users didn't like that. So we've moved to very accurate types of timers, which the standard digital timer, or you can go to timers which have much more functionality, but also give you a lot more capability. So for example, if you look at this, the user wants a level of convenience. Okay, they may not have a tremendous amount of experience. There's all sorts of different types of groups of users, but the bottom line is something that the user will be familiar with and that they're going to want to use. Well, this may look like a tremendously complex timer here, this microwave timer, but the reality is that by studying your users and understanding that 95% of the time, all they're going to do is microwave popcorn, you simply throw the piece of the popcorn bag into the microwave and you hit the button that says popcorn, and you got a perfectly done set of popcorn when you're done, other than having to remember how long you actually specifically have to cook the popcorn. Now, another thing, and this is one of the things that's really important to understand about your users, is understanding what your users know about the task that needs to be performed. So in user interface design, a lot of times, and almost many of the times, you're going to be designing for them to perform specific business functions, something that they've got to do in a work environment, which may be complex. It may be filling out travel authorization requests or doing finances and budgeting. Now, the users will have a knowledge of the task that they have to perform. The task itself may have changed over time, and the users may actually understand the entire history of why the task was changing. So, because you can get an understanding of the user as associated with the task, this can have a tremendous impact on how you design the interface. Because a user who is very familiar with the task is most of the time going to want to be able to do everything with a minimal number of screens changes. Okay, well, what does that mean? Well, if it's a complex task, there's a lot of stuff on the screen. But that is a piece of going through and understanding the user themselves. As we move forward and we look at understanding the task, and we understand the relationships between the tasks and the users, being able to ask the right questions of the users, of their understanding of the task, will be an important part that you're going to take in the actual design process. The tools that they're using. Remember, there's a difference between the task and the tool. A task may be preparing an authorization request. Your tool may be a paper form or your tool may be a computer form, okay? Now, understanding the tools and understanding the users, one good thing to understand about your users is if they can't get the task done with the tool that you give them, they're probably going to find an alternate way to do that. And we see this happen all the time. For example, there are tremendously good tools online for being able to balance a checkbook and being able to cash checks and do all those things. Yet a large number of people still simply keep the paper version of that's in the top of the checkbook and do it by hand. That's not because that's simply more convenient or anything else. It's just because they've got a familiarity with that and they haven't moved on to using the tools that are available to them. Okay? They will always find alternatives to things they don't want to do or go with the familiar route. So what we're going to do here is we're going to look at first some questions that we've done, and we did this in Users Part 1. We're looking at different questions that you can ask the users on the tools, and these questions are important questions. Like, where did you learn to use the tool? Was this from formal education? And how long have you been using the tool? And what's your familiarity with the tool? Other things like, do you like tools that are keyboard-based or phone-based or mouse-based? Okay, let's go in, and these are questions about the user and the tool. We have the user and the task, and we have the understanding of the user themselves. All three of those being important parts of the HCI that you're going to be doing and the interface design that you're doing. Now, last part of this lecture is going to be looking at, again, we've looked at asking questions to the users. We've also talked about how to do the interview process and also being able to do this through surveys. There's a little bit more information about surveys that we should really cover here. So this is going back to the concept of the surveys that we have of surveying users to get information. Remember, surveys are a convenient method to get information and be able to aggregate that information into meaningful information that you can use in your design. So when we did those surveys, we had different types of scales, questions that were scale-based questions. For example, the standard ordinal scale example. Is this very important to you? Is this not important at all? Or do we not even know? Okay, well, this is an ordinal scale. This is a question that you would ask. You would get the results. You would aggregate those results into something and say, well, on average, users found this to be important, but not very important. It's a nice little scale there. Some of the other ways that you would be able to ask questions and some of these other scales, which are important for you to know because you will be writing surveys. It's the concept of an interval scale. How many mistakes did you make a day? How many times do you do this task? 1 to 2, 3 to 5, whatever. Those are very useful. It's also very useful that you actually have interval ranges that make sense. So when you're creating these questions, it's not just, all right, we're going to make the intervals of 5 each, 1 to 5, 6 to 10, 11 to 15. Okay, you need information about the part of that scale that is important to you in the design. And that means that those scales may be 1 to 2, 3 to 10, 11 to 50, 51 to 100. Notice that scale got larger and larger as you went. But if the important part of that scale is, well, they do it a ton, but I'm really interested in the people that don't do it very frequently, I want to know the ones that do it 0, 1, and 2, the scale is going to be much tighter on that end. What we also have is this concept of the meaningful scale. The meaningful scale just basically means how meaningful is this? So, a concept of an endorsement. Do you endorse this as definitely true or definitely false? But there's a meaningful scale between that. The meaningful scale also has a lot of different permutations, such as the concept of frequency. Do you always do this? Do you never do this? Okay, is this have a high level of intensity or a low level of intensity, such as a pain scale? Okay, something like, did this influence you or have tremendous influence on you, or did it have zero influence on you? Is this better than this, or is this worse than this? Those are all concepts of meaningfulness that can be measured on a scale. And it is important to put it on a scale because the bottom line is that users aren't always going to be extremely influenced by something or never influenced by something. Things can have a mild influence. When you saw that ad for such and such, did that have an influence on whether you bought the product? Was it a tremendous influence? Was it a small influence? Or was it just, I now have knowledge of that? Okay. That is important to you because you want to know what is the impact of what you're doing. So some simple examples of how you would use this all in a practice of a survey. Here's just a sample survey, some sample questions. You've seen these before. You've done surveys. I'm pretty sure that you've done them. And as we finish this up, the bottom line is getting that feedback from the users. The remembering of questions should be important. They're either going to be important to you or important to the user. If a question doesn't have an importance on what either you or the user, don't ask it because you've only got a limited time span that you're going to be able to have that user working on that survey. And if you've got too many questions, the validity of your results is going to go down. And you need to know accurately, as best as you can, that information so that you can use it for the decisions that you've got to make. And in this case, at HCI, in the user interface design. So understanding how all this is put together is extremely important. So what have we learned about users? What we've learned is that users have a tremendous number of individual characteristics. These characteristics are going to influence the way they see things, the way that they do things, the way that they perform tasks. But the bottom line to you is that they're going to influence the way that you create a user interface design. Users can be put into groups, okay? And we can put them into groups. We typically call that stereotyping, but it's not really stereotyping because we want them in groups based on how it affects the way that we design. These are expert users. These are novice users. These are people very familiar with the task. These are people unfamiliar with the task. Those affect your design. It's important to understand the users because the users are the ones who have the end say of whether a system is successful, and know that the users will reject those designs that they don't like or don't have a level of familiarity with, and they'll find some other way to do it. If you get that understanding of the users, you're going to have much more success in your design process, and that is going to be extremely important to you if you are doing this type of design. Remember, success or failure rests on your knowledge of that user. Thank you very much. Signing out.